Hey guys, tonight we're wandering back thousands of years to a land where the morning began not with the sound of a rooster, but the whisper of sacred chants echoing through sun-warmed stone corridors. This is ancient Egypt, not the one filled with pharaohs posing for eternity in golden masks, but the real quiet Egypt, the one that breathed through the courtyards of forgotten temples, where barefoot servants stirred at dawn to prepare the sacred spaces before the gods awoke. You're not royalty in this story. You're not even a scribe. You're something simpler, humbler, and perhaps more mysterious. A temple purifier, one of the countless hands behind the smooth-running heart of ritual life. Your duty? To keep the gods' house clean. Not just free of dust, but free of bad air, bad thoughts, bad energy. Because here, in the House of Life, a bit of dirt isn't just mess. It's a spiritual offence. Before we really step into that world, let's take a slow breath together. And if you haven't already, maybe tap that like button or subscribe, but only if you truly find joy in this quiet corner of history we explore together. It means more than you know. I also love reading where you're listening from. Maybe you're tucked under a blanket in California. Maybe you're listening from a quiet apartment in Mumbai, wherever you are. Drop a comment and tell me what time it is there. This little bedtime history circle has reached places I never imagined. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a soft fan, and let the world fade for a while. You're about to begin your day in Thebes, the city of 100 gates, sometime around 1250 BCE. The Nile is low, the breeze is warm, and the gods, well, they are waiting. You wake on a mat of woven reed. Your body aches slightly from the hard floor, but it's a familiar ache, and you've learned not to mind it. Above you, the first light has just begun to filter through the slits in the mud brick walls. Your quarters are small and undecorated, shared with others who serve the temple. Incense carriers, scribes, young initiates barely past their first shaving. Everyone sleeps close side by side, legs tangled, dreams whispered through dry lips. The room smells faintly of sweat, sand, and something sharper. The remnants of yesterday's incense clinging to the fibres of your cloak. You sit up slowly. The floor is cool against your feet. You're still barefoot, of course. Shoes are for priests, for the highborn, or for journeys too long to ignore the sharpness of the earth. You splash water from a clay bowl onto your face, the liquid shockingly cold from sitting overnight in the corner shade. There's no soap. You scrub with a smooth bit of natron, a salty mineral dug from the desert. Its grains rough against your skin. It's not pleasant, but it purifies. And that's your task. Not comfort, not beauty, but purification. The gods notice things like that. A low bell sounds in the distance. That's the cue. The door creaks open, and the day officially begins. You and the others shuffle out into the narrow alleyway between buildings, where the sand has already started to warm. The temple lies ahead, just beyond the edge of the servants' quarter. You can see its entrance now, flanked by towering statues whose stone faces do not blink. Above them, painted vultures and sacred eyes gaze outward from the limestone walls, faded from centuries of sun, but still watching. Always watching. And this is where your work begins. The temple courtyard greets you with its usual quiet vastness. That kind of silence that feels deliberate, like even the birds know not to sing here. The air is cool still, though the heat will rise soon enough. You move with the others across the packed earth, feet making soft pads against the stone-paved path, the hem of your linen kilt brushing your calves with each step. The scent here is different from the quarters behind you. It carries a certain weight, a blend of ancient stone, cold water, and crushed myrrh. There is a faint trace of firewood smoke too, coming from the preparation kitchens behind the sanctuary wall, where they will later heat oils and boil herbs for cleansing. Nothing in this space is allowed to smell ordinary. Even the dust seems sacred. You do not enter through the main gate like the priests or temple officials. Instead, there is a side passage, a low shaded hallway lined with hieroglyphs that have watched 1,000 such mornings before yours. Your fingertips brush the carved wall almost unconsciously, the figures smooth and worn from years of similar touches. There's Thoth with his ibis head, recording the truth of the world, and Hathor smiling in her cow's crown, her arms extended, as if welcoming you into the task ahead. There is comfort in their presence, as if the gods approve of your effort, even if they will never speak your name aloud. The purification pool is waiting, and you can already hear the water rippling gently in its stone basin as you approach. It is fed by a narrow channel from the Nile, filtered through layers of sand and silt before it reaches the temple grounds. The water is cold, always cold even under the burning sun. As you disrobe beside the pool, folding your linen cloth neatly despite the urgency of the task, the gooseflesh rises on your skin in anticipation. Ritual washing is never hurried. You wade in slowly, letting the water cover you in layers. First the feet, then the knees, then you kneel until it reaches your shoulders. You lower your head and hold your breath beneath the surface, just long enough to count to 7. That's the number they told you the gods favoured for cleansing. When you rise again, water drips from your eyelashes like dew. You feel the cold inside your bones, but also a strange lightness, as if part of your thoughts were left in the pool, dissolved like desert salt. Back on the edge of the basin, you dry with abor, sun-warmed cloth and redress in fresh linen. The fabric is thin, nearly translucent, but that is proper. Heavy clothing holds impurity. The cleaner you appear, the closer to divine order you become. A senior servant waits at the far end of the passage holding a tray of offerings. Your task this morning is with the inner sanctum. That is rare. You're not always trusted to go so near. But today is different. Perhaps someone is sick. Perhaps the high priest himself has delayed. Perhaps the gods, in their quiet whims, have chosen you to fill a moment's gap. The tray is simple. A small dish of salt, 2 lotus blossoms floating in a clay bowl of water, and a bundle of burning papyrus reeds tied together with a red cord. These are tools, not symbols. You will not speak any prayers aloud. That is not your right. You are not a priest. But your hands must be steady, your footsteps precise, your heart calm. That is enough. You take the tray carefully, bow slightly, and begin the walk toward the sanctuary. Each doorway you pass through is narrower than the last, as if the temple itself is inhaling, drawing you inward. The light fades with each step. Soon you're in shadow, lit only by small oil lamps tucked into wall niches. The flame flickers softly, and the air smells of old stone and faint resin. Ahead, the sanctuary lies behind one last curtain of fine linen. You pause. Your mouth is dry. You do not enter hastily. The curtain parts slowly under your hand, and the chamber beyond welcomes you with a stillness so deep it feels like sound itself has been banished. In the centre, raised on a platform of dark stone, sits the shrine, gold-covered wood, wrapped in bands of linen, and inscribed with sacred words that you do not know how to read. Inside that shrine is the statue of the god, or so they say. No one sees it, not even most of the priests. Only the high priest himself during the first light of the festival days. Still, you bow to it because belief does not require sight. You kneel, the tray balanced before you, and begin your task. The lotus is dipped into the bowl and used to anoint the air, not the statue. You do not touch what is divine. Instead, you flick droplets into the corners of the chamber, letting the petals sway in your hand like a brush painting silence. You scatter the salt in a slow arc across the threshold. The burning papyrus hisses softly, and smoke curls toward the ceiling in thin grey ribbons. You hold the bundle aloft until the flame dies on its own, never blowing it out, never forcing its breath away. When the final wisp vanishes, your work is done. You rise slowly, your knees aching from the hard floor. The tray is lighter now. The room feels clearer somehow, as if the smoke carried something away with it. Maybe it did. You step backward, always facing the shrine, and pull the curtain closed once more. Outside, the corridor is warmer, brighter. You've only been inside a few minutes, but the sun has climbed. Another. Servant waits to take the tray. You nod silently and return to the pool, ready to begin again. The sun has risen higher now, casting longer shadows through the stone colonnades and warming the surfaces that had been cool just an hour earlier. As you emerge from the sanctuary and return along the narrow corridor, something about the outer light feels sharper, almost too alive after the hush of that inner space. Your eyes squint slightly, your skin tingles from the contrast. The basin of water near the courtyard still ripples gently, its surface now touched with reflections of the sun's golden blaze. You do not go back into it yet. You sit for a while in the shade of one of the tall columns, the base carved with symbols you've never been taught to read. You trace one with your fingertip absently. The lines feel familiar, as if your skin knows more than your mind. There is no rush. Ritual, you've learned, has its own pace, a slow unfurling like papyrus leaves opening in morning light. You're not meant to move too fast or speak too loudly. The gods frown on haste, so you sit with your back against the warm stone and allow yourself a moment of stillness. Somewhere nearby, a scribe is murmuring lines from the Book of Coming Forth by Day, his voice low and rhythmic, like the flowing of a slow river. The words were meant for the dead, but you find them oddly calming even as a living servant. Perhaps because death never feels too far away in Egypt. Not in a frightening way, just in a matter-of-fact one. Death is not an end here. It's another room, one entered through the right doorway, if you've remembered the words. A boy walks past you carrying a woven basket filled with small clay jars. He can't be more than 12. His feet are caked with dust, and his linen wrap is streaked from the dye pots, but he moves with purpose. You remember being his age, just starting at the temple, frightened of dropping a jar or misplacing a coal. Back then you used to sneak glances at the priestesses too, their faces painted with red ochre and eyes rimmed with kohl. Their steps graceful even as they carried heavy trays. They were never allowed inside the main sanctuary, of course, but they had their own rituals, their own chambers. Everyone did. There is a ritual for nearly everything here. Eating, bathing, lighting a lamp. The temple is a machine of sacred repetition, and you are one of its small moving parts. Eventually, the heat becomes too much to ignore. You rise, brush sand from the back of your knees, and return to the side corridor. The pool is calling again. Not for purification this time, but for calm. You crouch beside the edge and dip your hands into the water, watching the ripples spread out like tiny waves over a sleeping sea. You cup some into your mouth, just enough to wet your tongue. It tastes faintly of stone and sun. Behind you, the sound of feet approaching makes you turn. A familiar face. An older man, his head shaved smooth. A thin scar visible near his ear. He nods to you in quiet recognition and lowers himself beside you. No words are exchanged. He begins to pour oil from a small flask into a shallow dish, preparing to anoint the sacred floor in the offering hall. He doesn't need help, but you stay anyway. Not everything needs to be spoken. Presence is its own kind of service. When he leaves, you linger a while longer. Across the courtyard, near the outer wall, the shadows have begun to gather again. Not from the setting sun, not yet, but from the sheer weight of heat pressing down. A woman sweeps the walkway with a reed broom, her strokes slow and deliberate, pushing sand and stray petals toward the edge. Even the smallest bits of debris are not welcome near the sacred doors. Her broom makes a soft hush-hush sound that blends with the faint ringing of bronze wind chimes hanging near the priest's sleeping quarters. It is perhaps the most peaceful moment of the day. Later you are sent to the storeroom. It is cooler inside, built partly underground, the air thick with the scent of dried herbs and crushed bark. Here the temple keeps what it needs for its endless rituals. You pass shelves of rolled linen, each marked with careful symbols for funerary use. You run your fingers along rows of pottery filled with resin and honey and natron and frankincense. Your task is to prepare bundles for the evening offering. One for each altar, 2 pinches of salt, a folded strip of cloth, 3 incense cones. These will be set at the base of each statue, renewed as the light begins to dim. You work quietly, methodically, your movements practiced now from months of repetition. But even in the repetition, something feels different today. Maybe because you were allowed into the sanctuary. Maybe because the morning felt more still than usual. Maybe the gods noticed you today. Or maybe not. You never really know. The gods are silent, always. But silence doesn't mean absence. You wrap each bundle in papyrus, tie it with red thread, and place it into the tray with a kind of reverence you didn't have when you first started. You didn't understand then. You do now. Every thread, every pinch of sulco, salt, every motion, no matter how small, is a part of something ancient. When you finally return to the upper courtyard, the sky is beginning to change colour. The sun, now slightly lower, paints the sandstone walls with amber light. The air has cooled slightly, and a breeze stirs the palm leaves near the outer gate. A bell chimes again. Evening approaches, but your day is not yet done. The amber light of late afternoon stretches long and golden across the temple floor, softening the hard lines of stone and bathing the inner columns in a dreamy haze. You walk with care now, the tray of bundles balanced in both hands, the red ties on each one fluttering faintly in the breeze that seems to breathe through the corridors like something alive. The wind here has its own rhythm slipping through the temple as though it too must pay respect before it leaves. Your sandals scuff lightly against the dust-smoothed path. The only sound beside the far-off creak of a wooden door and the occasional soft cough of another worker somewhere behind a wall. These are the final hours of the day, but in a temple that means little. Time bends around the rituals here. There are no true beginnings or ends, only transitions. And now it is your turn to tend to one of them. You arrive at the lesser hall first, the one dedicated to the household gods. These are not the grand deities of state ceremonies or public prayer. These are quieter forces, protectors of grain jars and sleeping children, spirits who guard against scorpions and night terrors. Their altars are smaller, nestled in shaded alcoves away from the procession of the main sanctuary. But they are no less important. You bow slightly before approaching the first altar, not out of obligation, but habit. Reverence, once repeated enough, becomes something you carry in your bones. The bundle is placed with slow precision at the base of the tiny statue, a worn figure with feline features and a missing left ear. You wonder, not for the first time, who carved it. How many hands have carried offerings here before yours? How many voices have whispered hopes into this very corner, praying for safe births, healed fevers, a bit of mercy when none seemed left in the world? You move to the next altar and repeat the process. Place the bundle, light the incense, wait until the smoke curls just right, not too quickly, not too faint. There is a rhythm to it, one you've come to understand like the beat of a heart. Scent rises and mixes with the warm air, earthy and sweet. For a brief moment the smell is all there is, wiping away the ache in your knees, the dryness in your mouth, the dull weight behind your eyes. Incense was always meant to reach the divine first, long before your words, long before any song. Smoke is the offering that knows how to rise on its own. The main sanctuary is next, and though you are not going back inside, your work brushes close to its edge. You stop at the threshold, the edge of the great curtain now golden in the light. You place a bundle in a small clay bowl beside the door, where it will be retrieved by the high priest after nightfall. You do not see him. You rarely do. His presence is like that of the gods themselves, distant, respected, mostly imagined, but you know he has passed here today because the footprints are still visible in the fine dust near the entrance, round and smooth with the shape of polished sandals. You add your own mark to the dust as you step back and bow again. The bowl holds your part of the day's offering now, your quiet contribution to a ritual much older than your own name. As the sun begins to dip toward the horizon, the temple begins to shift. Shadows lengthen, but they do not darken. Instead, they cool the air and soften the voices. The servants speak, more quietly now, their movements slower, deliberate. No one rushes in a temple, not even when the night comes. You retreat back toward the courtyard, the empty tray tucked under your arm, and pause once again at the pool. The surface is darker now, reflecting the pinks and purples of the fading sky. You dip your fingers into the water, not to clean, but to feel something steady. The pool is always the same, no matter what the day has brought. That steadiness soothes you in ways even words cannot. Dinner is not far off, though there will be no feasting. The temple servants eat simply. A bowl of lentils, a piece of flatbread, a dried fig, if the harvest was kind. You look forward to it not for the taste but for the sitting, the talking, the way the others lean close and share small stories in low voices, even if the stories are always the same. Someone tripped in the granary again. A cat stole the fish from the kitchen ledge. One of the priestesses dropped her scroll in the water and spent the next hour weeping over the ink-stained mess. These things matter because they belong to you, to the life between the rituals, the life that is your own. By the time you make it back to the servants' quarters, the sky is a deep velvet blue. A single star flickers above the temple roof, the first to dare appear. You lie on your mat once more, the straw pressing against your back, the linen cloth damp with the heat that lingers even after the sun is gone. Around you, others are settling too, murmuring their last words, their last laughter. Someone sighs, another scratches at a mosquito bite, and one of the younger boys whispers a half-remembered hymn before sleep steals him away. Your eyes close slowly. The day is done, but the gods are never sleeping. You can feel them watching, not harshly but patiently. They do not need to speak. They only need you to return again in the morning. And you will. Before the first bird cries into the pale blue silence, and long before any sunlight slips over the edge of the eastern desert, you're already awake. Not with alarm or urgency, but with that soft intuition that temple servants grow into over time. The quiet sense that the world is ready to begin again, and you must move with it. Your back aches gently from the stiffness of sleep on the mat, and your arms tingle slightly where they had curled beneath your head. Around you, others shift and sigh in their sleep, the room still thick with the sour scent of close breathing and unwashed cloth. One of the younger boys mumbles a half-sentence in his dream, and you wait a moment before rising, not wanting to wake him just yet. There's something sacred in those last few minutes before full morning, when the world is still halfway between the dark and the day. It feels like the gods have not quite opened their eyes yet. You pull your linen wrap tight across your chest and step outside into the courtyard. The air is sharp against your skin, not cold exactly, but carrying the full, clean crispness that only exists before dawn. The sand beneath your feet is cool and soft, brushed smooth by the wind during the night. You walk across it barefoot, deliberately slow, not to avoid sound, but because speed has no place in this hour. The temple rises quietly before you, its great walls now bluish-grey in the half-light, the carvings along its base still hidden in shadow. Even the statues look gentler now, their stern faces softened by the absence of sun. You know every crack and curve of those stones by now. You know where the birds nest behind the shoulder of the falcon god, and where the rainwater sometimes leaves a stain beneath the foot of the goddess with the vulture wings. It feels strange to care about stone, but here, stone watches, remembers. It holds the stories you are not allowed to tell. You reach the water basin again, kneel, and splash your face in silence. The cold is deeper at this hour, almost biting, and it brings you fully into your body. You whisper the breath prayer under your breath as you've been taught. Not a chant exactly, but more a recognition, a reminder. You're clean, you're calm, you're ready to serve. There's no one around to hear you, but that never mattered. The gods do not need ears. You clean your hands, your feet, the back of your neck, and sit on your heels for a moment, feeling the water dry in the gentle air. The silence is not empty. It hums, it presses softly at the edge of your thoughts, as if the walls themselves are waiting. By the time the light begins to shift from blue to gold, a few others have risen. Quiet footsteps echo in the halls now, light and measured, like leaves skimming across stone. Someone has lit the first oil lamp in the preparation chamber, You smell it before you see it. That familiar mixture of burning flax and resin, smoky and faintly sweet. You walk toward the scent and find an older servant arranging offerings for the morning tables. His hands are steady, his brow already damp with effort. You help him without speaking, taking the small clay jars from his tray and setting them in their places. Fig paste, barley cakes, a handful of dates arranged carefully in a dish shaped like a lotus leaf. Each item is placed with intention, not just for balance, but for meaning. Everything has a reason here. Nothing is random. The gods notice sloppiness. Together you carry the offerings toward the hall of daily rites. The doors are not yet open to the sun, but the light seeps in through high slits near the ceiling, casting long slivers of brightness that look like blades on the floor. You place the trays at the edge of the dais, where the priests will later complete the morning invocations. You step back, careful not to breathe too heavily, not to shift too suddenly. This part is not yours. You've brought what is needed. You leave before the prayers begin. Back in the outer court, the city is beginning to stir. Far off, past the temple walls, you can hear the voices of market women setting up their stalls, their laughter mixing with the wooden creak of carts and the thud of pottery being lowered to the ground. Someone somewhere calls for a goat, and a baby begins to cry. The everyday world has returned, but within these walls, time still holds its breath. Your next task takes you down into the herb chamber, a long, cool room built partially beneath the ground to keep the plants fresh. It smells alive down here, even without sun, like crushed leaves, bitter roots, and the damp echo of earth. Shelves line the walls filled with bundles wrapped in cloth, tied with reed cord and marked with small red symbols. You have learned some of them by now. One for calming sleep, one for easing fever, one for anointing the sick. You take a bundle of dried kaifi flowers and place it in the mortar, grinding slowly with the stone. The scent rises, soft and spicy, and you can almost feel the sleep it used to give your mother when she would press a poultice to her temple at night. She used to say the gods had favourite smells, just like people, that some scents pleased them more than others, and you could never really know which, so you should always offer the ones that made you feel quiet inside. You think about that now as you grind the kaifi and add a drop of oil from the pressed olives. You're not sure if the gods care for this mixture, but it calms your hands as you work, and maybe that's enough. By the time you leave the chamber, the sun is touching the tops of the palm trees, and golden light is falling into the courtyard like warm cloth draped from above. The shadows are still long, but retreating. You walk slowly back toward the main hallway, the scent of herbs still clinging to your skin and your fingers stained faintly green. The day has fully begun, and once again you have returned with it. By the time the sun begins to climb to its full height, the temple stones feel hotter beneath your feet, as though the earth itself is remembering the intensity of every summer that has passed before this one. The shadows retreat to the very base of the walls, shrinking like quiet observers with no more room to hide. You feel the heat press against your back even as you move from shaded corridor to shaded corridor. The linen wrap that kept you warm at dawn now clings to your body, damp from sweat that starts at the nape of your neck and travels down in slow, irritating trickles. You've long stopped noticing it as discomfort. Now, it's more of a reminder. The body works, and so must you. The midday hours in the temple are not for idleness, though the pace slows. This is when the air becomes thickest, when movement becomes more deliberate, as though each action must first be approved by the heat. You carry a new batch of herb bundles toward the outer shrine, your arms full of reed-wrapped offerings. These are simpler than those made for the main sanctum, meant for travellers who stop to whisper hopes into the breeze as they pass, meant for mothers who press their foreheads to the carved stone and whisper their children's names with breath that shakes. You've seen them from the narrow viewing slit behind the offering gate. Women with baskets on their heads, men with cracked feet and empty satchels, all of them standing still for a brief moment before moving on. None of them see you, but you watch them place tiny charms, small figures, even broken bits of shell as tribute. Not because the gods require it, but because humans need to leave something behind when they ask for mercy. You kneel by the altar and arrange the herb bundles with care, one beside the carved foot of the lion-headed goddess, one beside the bowl of sand that holds the fragments of old votive lamps. The smell of crushed myrrh still lingers in the air from the morning, mingling now with the sharper edge of sun-warmed stone. You breathe through your mouth, not because of the scent, but because your nose feels dry. The wind barely moves here. It's as if the heat holds everything in place, and even the air itself. Behind you, a soft scuff of sandals signals the approach of another servant. It's Nari, a young girl, no older than your sister was when you left home. Her hands are soaked with ash, her dark braids tied back loosely as always. She carries a small bowl of water in one hand and a cloth in the other. She nods to you as she passes, a silent acknowledgement, then kneels beside the western column and begins wiping down the carved lotus petals that decorate its base. The two of you work in companionable silence. There is no need for talk during these hours. Words feel heavy when the sun is this high. You simply exist side by side, two pieces of the temple's quiet machinery humming gently toward dusk. A while later, the bell chimes. Not the large one from the sanctuary, but the smaller, thinner bell hung above the meal courtyard. You feel a pulse of relief in your belly, not from hunger, but from the break. Food is not a feast here, but it is welcome. You make your way toward the shaded space where mats are laid out and bowls are set in long rows. Others gather too, some wiping their forearms with the edges of their wraps, others with their faces still smudged from incense dust. The smell of lentils and garlic fills the air, soft and earthy, carried on the breeze that seems to have returned with the bell. You sit cross-legged and accept your portion without ceremony. A small round of flatbread, a scoop of mash, a wedge of dried fig. The flavours are mild, nothing meant to excite, only to sustain. You chew slowly, staring at the cracked edge of the stone path beyond the mat. Someone next to you mutters a joke about a mouse stealing barley from the storeroom, and a few soft laughs ripple through the group. You smile but do not join in. Your mind is elsewhere. You're thinking about the way the shadow moved across the altar earlier, how it seemed to curl around the offering bowl like a hand. Or perhaps you're simply tired. Midday is like that. The thoughts begin to wander in wide, soft circles, looping back to things that don't matter and never quite arriving anywhere. You finish your meal and stand brushing crumbs from your lap, the fig sweetness still clinging faintly to your teeth. Around you, the others begin to stir again, some stretching, some already returning to the tasks waiting just beyond the courtyard. You return to the corridor behind the sanctuary, where the air is always cooler, the light dimmer. There's a water jar tucked in a niche here, and you take a long sip, holding the clay rim to your lips until your breath slows. You close your eyes for a moment and rest your head against the wall. The stone is warm but steady. Your thoughts drift again, this time to the village you left months ago. You remember the sound of your mother's voice calling you to come in from the fields, the feel of wet mud between your toes during the flood season, the way your father used to hum while sharpening tools. These memories do not hurt. They are soft now, like worn cloth, something you can wrap around yourself when the temple feels too wide and empty. You open your eyes and blink against the light. Somewhere deeper inside the temple, the wind has caught a chime, and the soft ring floats through the hall like a signal. Afternoon is passing, and the next part of the day is waiting. You rise, tuck the cloth back over your shoulder, and begin to walk again, each step quiet, each motion folded into the rhythm of stone and shadow. The chime's echo had barely finished unravelling through the stone halls when your footsteps turned down the shaded corridor once again, this time toward the inner storeroom where temple linens were kept in cedarwood trunks. There is no glamour to this part of the work. No candles flickering, no sacred incense rising in curls. Just folded cloth, some stiff with old oil, others smelling faintly of desert lavender used in their cleansing. You move slowly, checking for creases, wear and damage. As you've been taught, linen used in the temple must always appear untouched, though every square has known the press of hands, the weight of prayers, the traces of smoke and fire. You smooth the folds of one robe with the side of your palm and then stack it again precisely, as if you were tucking a child to sleep. One of the younger servants is already there, sorting through bundles of cloth strips meant to wrap small statues during the monthly festival of silence. He's muttering under his breath, perhaps repeating his instructions so he doesn't forget. You smile to yourself but do not interrupt. You were that boy once, lips dry with worry, hands fumbling over knots that never seemed to hold. Back then, even dusting a ceremonial stool had felt like a test you could fail. Time has softened those nerves now, not because the work matters less, but because it has shaped itself into you, like a river carving gently into stone, steady and slow until the line becomes part of the rock itself. Once the linens are stacked, you carry the selected bundle into the preparation chamber. The room here is empty, quiet, filled with the hush of mid-afternoon stillness. Its walls are bare except for two simple carvings near the door, one of an open hand, one of a flame. No one ever explained their meaning, but you've come to think of them as reminders. Give fully, move gently. That's all the gods ask. You place the linens beside the oil trays and begin to refill the lamps. The clay jars are heavy with the thick golden liquid pressed from last season's olives. As you pour it slowly into the mouth of each vessel, the scent rises warmly, reminding you of kitchens, of ordinary meals, of home, not the one you live in now, but the one where your aunt once sliced bread while singing to herself, her voice always one note too high. You miss her, though you rarely admit it. Longing does not belong in temple work, or at least it should not be visible, so you keep it folded inside like a dried flower tucked in a scroll. You light each lamp carefully, using a single taper so the flame travels evenly, one to the next, like breath passed between friends. When the last one flares to life, you sit for a moment beside them. The light is soft and golden, the shadows long and gentle across the floor. There's peace in this part of the day, a quiet satisfaction that settles over your shoulders like a shawl. The temple begins to hum again, not with voices, but with presence. The air feels fuller, as if the walls themselves are remembering their purpose. You rise and return to the courtyard, where the breeze has found its way back through the upper slits and the smell of cooking barley floats in faint waves from the kitchens. The sun has dropped lower now, casting a bronze sheen on the limestone walls. A few other servants are seated on the edge of the well, their legs swinging idly over the side, voices low, almost conspiratorial in tone. They're telling a story, Rob. One they've told before, about a priest who mistook a cat's tail for a sign from the gods and ended up fasting for 3 days straight. You chuckle softly under your breath and keep walking. Near the southern gate, so was saying, where the pilgrims sometimes gather to wait for the festival days, you're asked to sweep the path. The broom is made of bundled palm fronds tied tight with woven reed. It scratches against the stone as you work, brushing away fine sand and bits of leaf carried in by the afternoon gusts. With each stroke, a thought drifts through your mind, small and barely formed. You wonder how many others have swept this same path, felt the same ache in their back as the sun dipped behind the temple walls. You wonder if they, too, ever paused mid-motion and realised how strange it is that such quiet work could feel so necessary. When the path is clear, you stand and stretch, arms pulling upward toward the pale pink sky. The light now is changing again, softening into that dusky hue that turns everything gold and grey at once. Evening is not far, you feel it in your limbs, in the cooling stone under your feet, in the scent of approaching night that the wind begins to carry. Is the time when silence becomes heavier, when the temple seems to breathe in and hold its breath, waiting for darkness to fully arrive. You carry the broom back through the corridor and pause just before re-entering. The horizon glows faintly, like the inside of a clay lamp, and you let yourself stand there for a moment longer, not moving, not thinking, just being. Somewhere behind you, a bell will ring again soon. A new offering will need to be prepared. A floor will need to be swept again tomorrow. But for now, you are still. The courtyard had changed its character entirely by the time you stepped back through the colonnade. Where the light once danced brightly across the paving stones, it now lay in long ribbons of soft shadow. The hush of evening carried its own kind of weight. It was not the stillness of sleep, but rather the pause before ceremony, the temple holding its breath as it waited for the transition from day to night to complete its sacred turn. Lamps were already being lit by others, their golden light bouncing gently against the walls and turning the stone faces of the statues into flickering illusions. Eyes that seemed carved now glinted with soft fire, and for a brief moment you felt that they truly watched. You moved toward the western wing of the temple, where the minor gods of protection and passage were honoured. This section was often quieter than the main shrine, but no less holy. It was here that people brought their fears, not the grand ones about kings and floods and politics, but the quieter, more personal fears, a sick child, a failing crop, a dream that returned every night with the same unbearable weight. These altars received fewer flowers, but more whispered names, and it was your task tonight to prepare their lamps and sweep their ground and ensure that no lingering dirt or disorder remained to offend those watching spirits. You stepped carefully, carrying the small tray with fresh wicks, a vessel of oil, and a folded cloth to dry the bowls before the lighting. The tray was not heavy, but you held it as though it were a piece of ritual itself, each movement slow and without excess. You'd come to believe that stillness carried its own language in these walls, that the gods understood intention not by the grandeur of one's words, but by the rhythm of one's hands. And so you knelt at the first altar, where the carved jackal waited, patient and silent, as he had for centuries. You cleaned the stone base gently, the cloth soaked with rose water, so the air would sweeten even as the old ash was lifted away. The flame you lit after was small, barely more than a shimmer in the bowl, but it caught quickly, licking up the side of the wick before settling into a soft, steady glow. You lit the others the same way, one after another, until the western shrine was bathed in low-gold light, and the scent of warm oil and pressed rose petals began to rise into the cooling air. As you stood, you felt the hush deepen, as if the space itself had noticed your care and responded with approval. Back in the preparation hall, the bustle had slowed. A few servants finished folding cloth, others washed their hands in silence. Even conversation here became soft in the evenings, voices falling to whispers without being told. There was no rule written anywhere that dictated silence at this hour, yet it was followed by all, as if the temple itself demanded it with every cool breath of dusk wind. You took your seat near the stone bench where bundles of reed paper were kept, used to record inventories and small offerings. You weren't a scribe, and you couldn't read most of the glyphs, but you liked to sit near them all the same. The ink had its own smell, sharp, earthy, alive. It reminded you that everything here was recorded in some way, that your hands, your movements, your offerings, even your mistakes, were known by someone or something. One of the senior attendants passed by and placed a folded cloth beside you without a word. You unfolded it and found inside two small amulets, one of a cat, the other of a small ankh. These would be placed in the offering box at night, a quiet addition to the temple's ongoing prayers. You smiled at them without knowing why. There was something oddly comforting about their shape, their worn edges, their chipped paint. They were imperfect, clearly handled many times before, and yet they still belonged here. Just like you took them into the side chamber where the box was kept, a wooden container bound with copper wire and marked with the names of 3 protective spirits. You knelt, placed the amulets inside, and whispered the simple phrase of offering taught to you on your first week at the temple. It wasn't elaborate. It wasn't even poetic. Just a few words about peace, safety, and thanks. But when you spoke them, they felt real. more real than the chants you heard echo through the halls on festival days. Maybe because they were yours, or maybe because you had learned that gods rarely needed to be impressed. They just needed to be remembered. The night deepened slowly as you returned to the courtyard. A soft bell rang from the inner shrine. Not loud, not calling, just marking time. You sat for a moment at the base of one of the tall columns, back against its cool surface, watching as the last light of the sky faded from pale orange into deep indigo. Overhead, stars began to blink into view, not in great numbers, but enough to remind you that the world stretched far beyond these walls. You thought again about home, about your younger sister who used to chase birds through the field behind your family's hut, her laughter rising like birdsong itself. You missed her voice. You missed the smell of boiled onions on a morning when the winds came in from the marshes. But the temple had its own kind of family now, people whose faces you saw every day, whose footsteps you recognized in the dark. And in their quiet way, they missed things too. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at the hem of your wrap, lifting a few fallen petals from the altar steps. You watched them spin in the air and fall again. The world, it seemed, was always in motion, even when you were still. You closed your eyes, letting the sounds of night settle around you. Tomorrow it would begin again. The stars had thickened above the temple, their pale flicker now mirrored in the small oil lamps glowing across the courtyard, and the hush of true night had settled over the walls like a linen veil drawn across a sleeping face. The day's tasks were finished, and yet the temple never truly slept. Its stones, warmed by the long hours of sunlight, now exhaled their stored heat slowly into the dark, giving off a faint warmth that clung to the columns and steps like memory. You sat with your knees drawn close, your back resting against the worn edge of a relief carving that depicted a procession of priests holding lotus flowers. In the dim light, their faces seemed deeper somehow, the shadows lending them expressions they never had by day. You stayed quiet, not from tiredness alone, but because the speaking felt like it would crack the stillness. There was something sacred in the air, in this sliver of time between the falling of one day and the rising of the next. Around you, the few other servants who had lingered shared the silence in the same way one might share a meal. A boy nearby was softly rubbing a pebble between his palms, its clicking rhythmic and almost musical. An older woman, her shoulders draped in a threadbare shawl, hummed under her breath a song too old to name. You didn't know the words, but the melody sounded like it belonged to a field, or a fire, or maybe just a long walk home. These were the moments the temple never recorded. No ink captured them, no prayer echoed them back. But they felt as important as any ritual. When the wind returned, it carried with it the faint smell of burning palm husk, a scent used during late-night offerings to cleanse the breath of the sacred corridors. Somewhere inside, beyond the heavy curtain of the sanctuary, one of the high priests would be beginning the last devotion of the day. He would be dressed in ceremonial linen that never touched the floor, anointed with oil mixed with cinnamon and cardamom. He would step barefoot into the holiest of spaces, where even light bowed down to darkness, and offer prayers that no one else was allowed to hear. You would never witness it. You didn't need to. The act echoed out in waves, touching every servant, every stone, every sleeping hawk roosting above the lintel. You felt it in your bones, not as a sound, but as a stillness deeper than sleep. And so you stood eventually, drawn not by duty, but by rhythm, and walked back toward the smaller chamber you shared with 5 others. Their shapes were already curled on the mats, cloaked in the dim blue of starlight pouring through the lattice window. You stepped inside quietly, unwrapping the cloth from your shoulders and folding it beside your mat, your movements practiced and silent. As you lay down, the reed fibres creaked faintly beneath you, and your muscles, tired but not sore, seemed to sigh in relief. The scent of dust and dry linen, the breath of those near you, the low hum of night insects outside the wall, all of it blended into a single softness that welcomed you back without question. But sleep did not come immediately. Instead, your eyes traced the outline of the wooden ceiling beams, remembering a time when such silence would have frightened you. Your first weeks in the temple had been full of uncertainty. You remembered lying awake just like this, straining to hear your mother's voice in the dark, wondering whether you'd ever feel at home in these wide, echoing halls. You'd been too quiet then, too eager to do everything right, too afraid to make the gods angry. Now that fear had changed shape. It had become a kind of quiet respect, a deeper understanding that the gods were not watching you the way people did. They didn't notice mistakes the way a teacher might. They watched the way rivers do, patiently, without judgment, letting everything flow past until what is true finally surfaces. You turned onto your side, facing the wall, your fingers brushing the edge of your mat. Someone coughed softly behind you, and a moment later, you heard the soft scrape of a heel against the floor as one of the others shifted in their sleep. These were the rhythms of the temple you'd come to love. Not the chants or the incense or even the sacred pools, but this, the shared silence of those who served quietly, who never held the scrolls or wore the golden collars, who would never be carved in stone, but who made the sacred work possible, breath by breath. Outside, the wind made a low sighing sound as it curled along the outer courtyard. You imagined the statues hearing it too, their ancient ears carved to listen forever. Perhaps they understood more than anyone thought. Perhaps they remembered every whispered prayer, every offering made with trembling hands. And perhaps, in their stony silence, they kept the stories of those like you, those who lit the lamps and swept the paths and laid down the simple bundles of herbs day after day. Your eyes grew heavier, your breathing slowed, and as the night deepened, you felt yourself begin to drift, not into darkness, but into the soft, endless space of dreams, shaped like warm stone, the hush of sacred halls, and the quiet promise of another day waiting beyond the veil of sleep. You woke before the first crow of the temple rooster, stirred not by sound but by a feeling, the kind that rises from beneath, the skin rather than from any noise in the air. The sky outside your small lattice window was still a deep indigo, stars scattered loosely across it like forgotten seeds. You did not rush to sit up. For a moment you lay there in the warmth of your mat, your cheek pressed against the familiar woven ridges, your eyes tracing the ceiling beams, waiting for your breath to settle into the rhythm of the waking day. You'd begun to treasure this thin ribbon of time between sleep and duty, a space untouched by expectation, where nothing was asked of you, and nothing had yet been given. Then came the familiar shuffle of feet. The servant to your left stirred, and rose silently, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders in one smooth motion. You followed, wordless, both of you stepping lightly across the floor, your bodies still half in dreams. Outside, the air held that peculiar coolness that only appears for a short time before dawn, a gentle warning that the sun is on its way. You took a deep breath and let it fill your chest slowly. It smelled of dust and oil, and something faintly sweet, maybe the last traces of yesterday's incense, still clinging to the walls like a prayer not yet finished. You made your way to the Purification pool, the water darker now, nearly black, but so still it looked like glass. The surface reflected the faintest shimmer of stars, and for a brief moment, you saw your own face floating there, blurry and flickering. You stepped in slowly, the cold biting at your legs, but you did not wince. The body must be cleansed not just in skin but in spirit, and part of that meant accepting discomfort with grace. As the water reached your chest, you lowered yourself fully, letting your breath pause beneath the surface, your ears filling with the muffled hush that made everything sound far away and small. When you emerged, blinking against the dark, you felt new, not transformed but cleared, like a window wiped clean after a sandstorm. The linen robe you changed into was crisp and damp with the night's air, the fibres brushing your arms with a softness that always surprised you. You wrapped it close and moved into the corridor that led to the outer altar, where the first offerings of the morning would be laid. Already a few figures moved through the halls with oil lamps cupped in their hands, the flames swaying gently as they passed. One nodded at you, and you returned the gesture. There was no need for speech now. You had all become part of the same breath, exhaled slowly by the temple itself. At the base of the offering table, you laid down a small bundle wrapped in papyrus, containing bread, dried dates, and a sprig of crushed mint. It was not elaborate, but it was the first offering of the day, and that mattered more than its size. You bowed your head, letting your forehead rest lightly against the cool stone edge of the altar, whispering the short phrase of devotion taught to all new servants. It was barely a sentence, but you had said it so many times now it felt like part of your own breath. When you stepped back, the flame from a nearby lamp caught the edge of the bundle's cord just slightly, just enough to cast a long shadow behind it. You watched it stretch toward the wall and felt for a moment that you were being watched, not with menace, but with acknowledgement, as though the gods had noticed you again today. With the ritual complete, you turned toward the storage room to gather more supplies. You would need fresh cloth, 2 jars of barley paste, and a bowl of sand for the purification steps. As you walked, the light outside began to shift. The stars faded one by one, and the sky warmed to a faint lavender. You could see it now through the high slits near the ceiling, thin slices of sky turning slowly toward morning. You passed the kitchen on your way, where the first fires were being kindled. The scent of burning wood mixed with the tang of ground herbs, and your stomach growled softly, though you knew you wouldn't eat for another few hours. The corridor ahead was lit now by a single shaft of sunlight, piercing through the far window and cutting across the floor like a golden ribbon. You stopped there for just a moment and let it fall across your face. The warmth was gentle, like a hand placed on your cheek. This light was not yet hot or harsh. It was the light that came before labour, before noise, before sweat. The light that belonged to quiet moments, to unspoken hopes, to beginnings. You stood still, your eyes half closed, feeling the morning take shape around you. In a few minutes the bell would ring, others would join you. The sounds of water splashing, feet pattering, voices murmuring prayers would fill the air once more. But in that moment, you were alone with the light, with the breath of the temple walls, with the slow awakening of something sacred and patient. The day would begin again, and so would you. The golden ribbon of light that had brushed your cheek just moments ago was now beginning to spill further into the corridor, sweeping gently along the stone floor and tracing the faint depressions worn into it by countless footsteps before yours. You watched how it moved, slow and certain, with the steady rhythm of the sun itself, never rushing, never hesitating. In its glow, even the rough edges of the temple seemed softened, made smoother, more forgiving. You stepped into it fully, letting it wash over your shoulders, your arms, your fingertips. The warmth was deeper now, and it touched more than your skin. It pressed gently into your chest, as though reminding you that the work ahead was not a burden, but a purpose. By the time you reached the interior hall, the other servants were beginning to stir into full emotion. Someone was rolling out the cloths used to wrap the offering tables, their hands firm but unhurried. Another was stacking the thin wooden trays that would hold fruits and shaped loaves of bread, prepared earlier by the kitchen boys under the watchful eye of the chief cook. You joined in with quiet familiarity, gathering the small cups used for libations and inspecting each one for cracks or residue. The cups were not identical, some had chipped edges, others were darkened at the rim from frequent use, but they had been used for years, and their flaws gave them character, like familiar faces in a crowd. Once everything was in place, you carried 2 of the trays toward the eastern antechamber, where the lesser statues were housed. These were not the grand forms of the principal gods, not the towering figures whose names were chanted in festivals and carved into temple walls. These were smaller, humbler, though no less honoured, guardians of journeys, spirits of healing, watchers of the night. They stood in rows along the sides of the chamber, each one wrapped in linen and partially veiled, their eyes covered out of respect until the proper rites had been performed. You felt a chill pass over you as you entered, not from cold but from presence. These were the ones most people forgot existed, yet they were the ones closest to the ordinary struggles of daily life. You'd always liked them for that. You placed the trays before them with deliberate care, adjusting their position until each was centered, then kneeling for a moment with your hands resting gently on your thighs. You did not speak aloud. There was no need. The silence in this room was enough. It wrapped around you like a cloak, and you could feel your thoughts moving differently here. Slower, more grounded. You found yourself thinking again of home, of your uncle who once walked 3 days across the desert to deliver a bundle of reeds to the temple scribe. He had arrived sunburned and footsore, yet had spoken only of the stars he saw each night on his journey. You had not thought of that memory in years, yet it returned now, unbidden, with the clarity of something important. Maybe that was what the statues did, held space for the forgotten things to come back. A soft rustle behind you told you someone else had entered. You turned to see one of the senior boys, taller than most, his arms already stained with dye from the temple cloths he worked with. He didn't speak, but offered a slight nod, then moved past you to tend to the incense urns near the back wall. You both worked side by side for a time, wordless, the scrape of stone against floor and the flick of cloth the only sounds between you. When he finished, he paused beside one of the veiled statues and placed a single white pebble at its base. You knew better than to ask what it meant. Offerings were personal here, even the smallest ones. As you left the antechamber, the smell of incense had begun to drift in waves through the halls again, sweet and sharp, grounding you in the present. The bell had not yet rung, but the temple had fully awakened. You returned to the outer corridors, where more light now filtered in from the courtyards, illuminating carvings that were hidden just an hour before. You passed a column where the story of a great flood was etched, water waves rising in elegant loops beside the image of a kneeling priest holding up a fish. You traced the outline with your fingertip as you passed, the grooves warm from the sun. You had always loved this carving. It reminded you that the world had always faced chaos, and that people had always tried to meet it with prayer and hope. Soon the morning rites would begin. The priest would emerge, robed in fine linen, his head anointed, his voice echoing through the great hall as he spoke the ancient words. You would be nearby, unseen but present, carrying water, fetching bowls, adjusting cloth. You would not be named in any record, nor mentioned in any scroll, but you would be there, like the others before you, like the ones after. And perhaps that was the truest kind of devotion, not the glory of the ceremony, but the quiet labour behind it. You reached the main threshold and stepped into the full light of morning. The air had changed again, warmer now, filled with the mingling sounds of birds calling from the outer garden and sandals brushing stone. The temple was alive, its breath rising with the heat, its heart beating in the soft footsteps of those who served it. You took one last look at the sky, clear, wide, unending, and then returned to your tasks, where the sacred and the simple were, as always, one and the same. The light in the hall had deepened into a full golden brilliance now, no longer tentative as it had been earlier, but bold and steady, pouring down from the open ceiling slits and touching everything in its path with warmth. You moved through it with care, your shadow long and soft at your heels as you brought the freshly polished copper basin to the sanctum steps. Its surface gleamed faintly, reflecting little glimpses of the carved walls, the outlines of your arms, the edge of your linen wrap. It was not heavy, but you held it as though it were something far more fragile. Because here, in this space, everything had weight beyond its form. A cup was not just a cup. A basin was not just a vessel. Each was an extension of an offering, a silent word in the language of prayer. As you placed it down on the step, you felt that quiet, almost invisible shift in the air again. The kind that told you someone of rank had entered. You did not look up, because you knew the rules. Servants did not raise their eyes to the priest during the approach of the ritual. Instead, you bowed your head gently, your hands resting against your thighs, your posture a stillness learned over weeks and months of repetition. You heard the soft brush of fine linen moving past, the creak of leather sandals, and then the low murmur of invocation. It began like a breeze through leaves, not loud, not sharp, just the kind of sound that reminded the stone walls that they too were part of something alive. His voice continued as the priest walked deeper into the sanctum, the words now mixing with the rising scent of incense that someone had lit moments before. You caught its first breath just as it reached your nose, an offering of kai-fi, strong and sweet, made from honey, wine and myrrh. It was the scent of midnight temples, of full moons and whispered vows. And now, as it curled in the morning air, it layered over everything like a soft veil, joining the light in its gentle transformation of the space. You moved to the side as others entered to assist. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Each movement had been rehearsed into instinct, each hand lifted in unison, each tray passed with seamless grace. You felt yourself become part of that rhythm again, no longer just a single body, but a part of something woven, like a reed in a mat, like a note in a song. One by one, the ritual elements were brought forth. Wine in slender vases, shaped bread stacked on broad platters, lotus petals scattered in deliberate patterns across the inner steps. You had prepared many of these items just this morning, yet now they looked different, elevated by the act of use, by the presence of intention. The chant rose and fell in soft waves, the priest's voice steady and low. You couldn't always understand the words. They were old, some of them older than the walls around you, preserved in their perfect form like seeds held for planting across generations. But even when the meaning slipped past you, the sound carried its own kind of clarity. It was like water over stone, smoothing, shaping, whispering of the time longer than any single life. You took a small cloth and wiped down the side of the inner threshold, careful not to disturb the rows of petals now resting there. Your hand moved slowly, each swipe deliberate, as though you were cleaning not just dust, but the last trace of yesterday's breath. It was this kind of work that you had come to understand as the most sacred, the unnoticed tasks, the ones without ceremony or name. It reminded you of something an elder servant once told you when you first arrived, that the gods see not with eyes, but with balance, that for every grand gesture there must be a dozen quiet ones to hold it in place. You had not fully grasped it then. Now, with your knees bent and your hands smoothing the cloth against the cold stone, you did. As the ritual neared its close, the priest raised his hands in blessing, and the other servants around you knelt in sequence. You followed, bowing your head, the tips of your fingers touching the ground. The light had shifted again, streaming in at a lower angle now, illuminating the mist of the incense smoke that still lingered, like a dream in the centre of the hall. There was no applause, no moment of recognition. The ritual ended the way it began, quietly with the same breath that had begun moving through the temple at dawn. But something always remained in its wake, not a change in the space, but in you, like something inside. You had been pressed slightly into a new shape. Once the priest had left, you and the others began the slow work of clearing. The petals were gathered gently, the bread covered with cloth, the wine vessels returned to the rear chambers. You walked with quiet feet, your body tired but uncomplaining, your arms moving in the same deliberate patterns they always did. But inside there was a small warmth, one that came not from sunlight or movement, but from the knowledge that you had helped carry something ancient forward one more day. You passed the last of the trays through the corridor and paused for a moment near the entrance, your gaze falling once more on the carvings of gods and offerings etched into the wall. Their faces looked the same as they always had, patient and unmoved. But you felt, if only for a heartbeat, that they knew, that they had seen you in the work, and in that silence you smiled. By late morning, the intensity of the sunlight began to settle into something heavier, like a blanket too thick for comfort yet too familiar to shrug off. You stepped into the quiet of the herb courtyard, seeking a few moments of breath between duties. This small walled garden sat tucked at the eastern edge of the temple grounds, a rectangle of soil and stone where green things still dared to grow. The palm trees leaned lazily above the edges, casting a broken patchwork of shade across the ground, and the faintest sound of trickling water came from the corner where a clay basin overflowed just enough to nourish the plants clustered near its lip. It was not lush, this place, not extravagant, but it was living, and that, in a temple built of stone and stillness, made it sacred in its own quiet way. You walked the path between the garden beds, toes curling slightly in the sand, breathing in the sharp, earthy scents that rose from crushed leaves and sun-warmed stems. Basil, mint, sweet flag, and papyrus, all had been planted by careful hands, tended by servants like you across countless seasons. You bent to touch one of the mint sprigs and rolled it gently between your fingers. The oil clung to your skin, its scent fresh and cooling, chasing away the fatigue creeping into your muscles. It reminded you of the small bundle your aunt once tied into your tunic before a long journey, whispering that the gods would follow your scent and protect you like a watchful dog follows its master's trail. You hadn't believed her then, not really. But now, in the hush of this garden, the memory made something settle gently inside your chest. A shadow moved in the corner of your vision. One of the older women, a quiet servant with the lines like riverbeds across her face, was kneeling near the basin, rinsing a set of woven pouches. You'd seen her do this many times. She never hurried, never rushed, even when the bell called. She always finished her work with the same calm grace as if she was weaving time itself into each motion. She glanced up briefly and nodded at you, the corner of her mouth lifting in something that was not quite a smile but held the weight of one. You returned the nod and sat beside a low wall, resting your arms on your knees and letting your eyes drift lazily across the garden. The world beyond the walls was still there. You could hear it in the distant creak of wagon wheels on stone, in the occasional burst of laughter from the street beyond the outer gate. But inside this place it faded. Here the only things that mattered were the quiet rustle of leaves, the whisper of wind across pottery, the cool breath of shaded stone against your back. And perhaps that was why you came here whenever you could, even if it meant arriving a few breaths late to your next task. Because here you were not a servant performing a duty, you were simply a person sitting in the sun. The woman at the basin finished her rinsing and stood slowly, joints cracking like old wood. She gathered her cloths, patted the top of the water jar, and disappeared into the corridor without a word. You remained seated, alone now, your thoughts wandering gently, looping through half-formed memories and imagined futures. You thought again of your sister. Her name came to you like a song hummed too softly to sing. You wondered if she still chased birds, if she remembered your face, if she had learned to tie her own tunic yet. You wished you could have written, but there were no scribes for people like you, and no one sent letters to dusty homes along the canal banks. A small beetle skittered across the sand near your foot, glinting in the light, its body like a drop of obsidian. You watched it climb over a stone, disappear beneath a leaf, and then emerge again on the other side, determined and steady. You'd always admired that about small creatures. They never seemed to question their purpose. They simply moved forward. Eventually the spell of the garden began to thin. The air grew warmer, heavier, signalling that the quiet moment was nearly spent. You stood slowly, brushing the sand from your robe, and took one last walk around the edge of the garden, touching a leaf here, a stone there, as if saying farewell not to things, but to the feeling they gave you. Before stepping back through the corridor, you turned and looked once more at the basin. The water still rippled slightly from the woman's washing. It looked like a mirror turned sideways, as though it might show you not your face, but your past or future if you only stared long enough. You didn't linger. There was work waiting. But as you stepped back into the temple's main hall, the scent of mint still clinging faintly to your fingers, you carried something else with you too. Not just the memory of the garden, but the reminder that stillness had its own kind of power, that silence could hold not just rest, but meaning, and that sometimes, In the sacred spaces where nothing is spoken, the gods speak most clearly. The corridor swallowed you again, its walls familiar, its air cool despite the heat gathering outside. You adjusted the fold of your wrap as you walked, not for modesty, but to tuck the scent of mint deeper into the fabric, a quiet treasure you weren't yet ready to part with. Each step echoed softly on the stone, not loud, just enough to remind you that you were moving through a place older than memory. The temple had begun to settle into its midday rhythm now, that slow, deliberate pace where everyone moved with care, not out of reverence alone, but out of knowing. Knowing that the sun was at its peak and that every movement beneath it drew more sweat from the skin than it did progress from the day. You passed the open doors of the storeroom and paused briefly, scanning for the jar of dried lotus you'd been asked to retrieve. It was always near the back, nestled between larger vessels of barley, and the shallow trays of dried fish used for sacred meals. You remembered exactly where it sat because you had once knocked it over in your second week and spent nearly an hour gathering the fragile petals back into their jar with trembling hands, your heart thudding with the fear of punishment. No one had scolded you in the end, but you had never forgotten the lesson. Not everything that breaks is seen. Some errors live quietly, hidden behind careful corrections. You found the jar, cradled it carefully, and began to make your way toward the preparation chamber where the altar attendants were assembling the next round of offerings. The walk was longer than usual today, or maybe it only felt that way because the air had thickened with heat, turning each breath into something heavy and slow. The sun's angle had shifted, sending long fingers of light down into the corridor through narrow slits in the wall. They painted bright shapes onto the floor, golden and sharp, and you stepped between them like crossing a shallow stream, careful not to disturb the quiet geometry they cast. When you entered the chamber, a few of the others were already working, arranging bowls of figs and barley paste, laying out the patterned cloths used to line the sacred trays. The room smelled faintly of crushed cumin and linen warmed by the sun. You passed the jar to one of the older boys, who gave you a small nod without speaking. His fingers, stained faintly with saffron from earlier preparations, moved swiftly as he unwrapped a roll of thin cloth and began placing the lotus petals one by one atop the folded squares. You joined in without needing instruction. Your hands knew the rhythm now. Place, smooth, press, fold. Not too tight, not too loose. Just enough to keep the petals held in stillness, ready to be released during the sunset ritual when the god's likeness would be carried briefly outside to greet the fading sun. It was always a quiet affair, that moment. Not a public display like festival days, but a private exchange between the statue and the wind, a symbolic meeting of light and devotion. Someone brought in a small lamp and placed it near the back corner, chasing away the soft shadows that had begun to thicken as the light changed outside. The room brightened, and the quiet deepened. No one rushed. There was something in this kind of labour that resisted speed. If you hurried, the folds would twist, the bowls would tip, the symmetry would falter. So you moved with intent, letting your breath guide the pace of your hands. The jar of petals was nearly empty by the time the final tray was prepared, and you looked at it with a strange fondness, as if it had been a companion rather than a tool. You wiped its rim clean and tucked it back into the side shelf, brushing your fingers against the rough clay edge like a parting gesture. Afterward, you stepped out into the outer hallway and leaned briefly against the wall, feeling the texture of its carvings against your back. You didn't need to look to know which scene was behind you. It was the one of the harvest procession, men and women carrying baskets and musical instruments, with a single child in the middle holding a reed flute. You had always liked that carving, not because of the figures or the tools or even the detailed wheat etched near the child's feet, but because of the way the sculptor had given the child a slight turn of the head, as if looking not forward, but to the side. It made the whole scene feel real, like something remembered rather than imagined. You closed your eyes for a moment, letting the coolness of the stone seep into your spine. Somewhere nearby, someone had begun humming again, a low tune without words, the kind of melody that rises from hands that have worked for hours and no longer need to think. You listened for a few breaths before stepping away, refreshed not by rest but by rhythm. The corridor was empty now, and your shadow stretched long ahead of you as you returned to the central courtyard, where the stone gleamed in the brightness, and the world felt pause between one motion and the next duty awaited. You would sweep the outer walkway near the visitors' hall, the one that caught the afternoon dust in fine spiraled patterns. You'd need a cloth for your face and water if you could find it, but for now, you walked slowly, savouring the space between tasks. That fleeting moment where the body still carried the weight of one labour, while the mind prepared for the next. It was a sacred space in its own right, not a chamber, not a shrine, but a path, and you were learning each day how to walk it with care. The broom was already leaning against the low column near the walkway, its bundled reeds curled at the edges from long use. You reached for it without thought, lifting it into your hand like an old companion, and stepped toward the outer hall. The sun had shifted again, pulling shadows across the stone tiles in long slanted lines, as if the temple itself was preparing to recline beneath the weight of the day. This stretch of path ran along the eastern door, wall of the complex where visitors would occasionally gather during feast days or when special rites were conducted. Today it stood quiet, lined only with shallow bowls of half-spent oil, and the lingering scent of old incense clinging faintly to the stone. Sweeping here was a slow affair, not because the dust resisted, though it always returned before the next bell, but because each stroke of the broom required attention. The wind carried more than just sand through the courtyard. It brought tiny petals, scraps of linen thread, and sometimes even bits of leaf or feather that had drifted in from the sacred garden. You found them all as you worked, nudging them gently along with the bristles, creating small piles to be carried off later. The motion was rhythmic, almost meditative, the sound of reed against stone like the slow breathing of some great slumbering beast. Back and forth, step and drag, your body moved in quiet coordination with the broom, your thoughts trailing behind like a lazy stream curling through marshland. It was during this kind of work that your mind often wandered, slipping sideways into memories you didn't realise you'd kept. You thought of your mother's hands, how they used to move just like yours when she cleaned the steps outside your home in the mornings, her knuckles always pink from the cold water in the winter months. You remembered the tiny scolding she would give if your sweeping missed a corner, not out of anger, but from her stubborn belief that even the earth deserved to be treated with care. It had annoyed you then, that insistence on thoroughness. But now, as your own broom traced every line in the tile, you understood it not as fussiness, but as reverence. Halfway down the hall, a thin breeze stirred the air, lifting a curl of dust into the light. You paused, watching it spin briefly before settling again. The silence around you deepened. It was not the silence of emptiness, but of presence, the kind that made you feel like someone or something was nearby, even if unseen. You glanced toward the row of statues carved into the outer wall, their gazes fixed in eternal stillness. One held a crook, another an open palm, the third a bundle of scrolls across its chest. You didn't know the names of all of them, but you nodded anyway, a small gesture of acknowledgement, a habit you'd picked up from an elder servant years ago who swore it kept the day smoother. As you resumed sweeping, your eyes caught sight of a beetle, not unlike the one from the garden, struggling to climb over the uneven line where two stones met. It worked tirelessly, adjusting its path, slipping and trying again. You crouched and gently nudged it with a corner of your broom, helping it over the lip. It disappeared quickly into the crack, vanishing from sight, but you felt oddly satisfied, like you'd played a small part in a story no one else would witness. Once the path was clear, you stepped back and surveyed your work. The stone now gleamed where the dust had been lifted, its surface warm underfoot, the pattern of the tiles more visible. There was something strangely fulfilling in it. Not pride exactly, but a kind of quiet contentment that came from making a place ready for the feet of others, even if they never knew your name or noticed your effort. You wiped your brow with the back of your sleeve and leaned the broom back against the column, its bristles fanned slightly as if they too had settled into a kind of rest. A voice called softly from the inner hall, and you turned toward it. One of the younger girls, arms full of linen, was motioning for help with the washing. You nodded and began to follow her, your steps slow but steady, the heat of the sun still lingering on your skin like the memory of the touch. As you walked back through the corridor, you passed the basin near the herb courtyard and dipped your fingers in. The water was cool, deliciously so, and you brought a few drops to your neck, feeling the relief ripple down your spine. The world had become brighter, harsher outside, but in here, within these walls, everything held its balance. Later, when the sun began to lower itself toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the stone and washing the world in gold and grey, the last of the midday work would be set aside. And though the body would ache and the linen would be damp with sweat, there would be no complaint, only the knowledge that something had been done with care, that the temple still stood, breathing and sacred, held upright by the hands of those who asked for nothing but the chance to serve again tomorrow. The girl who had called you now walked a step ahead, her linen bundle gathered carefully into her arms, the fabric folding neatly where her chin had pressed it for balance. You followed her through this passage where the heat of the midday sun no longer reached, the stone under your feet cool again, and the scent of water lingered in the air. This corridor led to the southern chamber where the washing was done, a space tucked far enough from the main halls to keep the wet scent of soap and clay jars from interrupting the sanctity of the inner sanctum. It was a place of labour, not prayer, but you had come to respect its quiet rhythm in the same way one respects the pause between heartbeats. Inside, the chamber was lit only by 2 high slits near the roofline, which cast sharp, clean rectangles of light onto the floor. You and the girl set your bundles down on the smoothed ledge near the basins. The jars were already filled, wide-mouthed and lined with shallow channels where the washing stones sat. You dipped your hands into the nearest one and felt the grit of sand at the bottom, the water cold enough to sting for just a second before your skin adjusted. The cloth you lifted had the faintest purple hue, dyed with crushed berries from the garden and worn thin in places from many cycles of use. It smelled of smoke and citrus, and as you pressed it under the water, you could feel the weight of days caught in its fibres. Washing in the temple was not like washing at home. It was a ritual in itself. Each piece of cloth had been used in proximity to sacred space, had absorbed the breath of prayer, the sweat of devotion, the oils of offering. It had touched the skin of priests, had been folded over the altars, had perhaps even been laid upon the stone feet of a god's likeness during a festival night. And so you did not scrub roughly or rush. You dipped, pressed, and swept your palm over the surface in slow, even strokes, watching the fibres shift and shimmer beneath your fingers. The girl beside you hummed softly, her voice no louder than a breeze, and though you didn't know the tune, it made your hands move more easily, as if the melody wove itself through your arms and helped carry the weight of the work. After a time, your back began to ache, not sharply, but in the slow, blooming way that comes from repetition. You paused and rolled your shoulders gently, wiping a bead of sweat from your temple with the back of your wrist. Around you, the chamber was filled only with the sounds of water being moved, cloth being folded, breath being exhaled in quiet measures. It felt like a prayer, this silence, a different kind than the one spoken aloud in the shrine, a prayer of action, a prayer of attention. When you moved on to the second basin, you noticed that the water was slightly warmer, touched more by the slant of the sun, and the cloths here were heavier, coarser, the kind used for wrapping larger ceremonial objects. One piece was stained with what looked like old wine, or perhaps sacred oil, its edges curled slightly, as if it had once been left too long in the sun. You wondered who had handled it last, what ritual it had witnessed, whether it had draped the table during the new moon rites, or served as a covering during the morning procession for the sick child brought by her family last season. You would never know, but you cleaned it with the same care, your hands moving, as if the cloth still carried the memory of those moments. By the time you reached the final bundle, the sun had shifted again, and the light through the slits had begun to slide higher, painting the upper wall in gold. The girl had gone, her work finished, leaving her folded linen stacked neatly beside the doorway. You remained alone, finishing the last cloth. Your fingers sore now, your breathing steady but deeper. You hung it gently beside the others, where it would dry in the late warmth, its shadow long and waving slightly in the light breeze that slipped in through the open window. When you stepped outside again, the brightness caught you off guard. The sun was on its way down, not low yet, but softened. The air had changed. It no longer pressed on you, but wrapped around you like a thick, sleepy sigh. You walked slowly back toward the inner courtyard, your steps slower now, the ache in your shoulders, reminding you of the work just completed. There was no one to applaud it, no scribe to note it down, but the walls knew, the floor knew, you knew, and sometimes that was enough. By the time you returned to the courtyard, the temple had shifted into that quiet phase of the day when everything felt caught between stillness and motion. The light had turned to gold, not the sharp gold of midday, but a softer, dust-laden hue that made the edges of the columns glow and the shadows stretch across the floor like fingers reaching towards sleep. You moved slowly across the stones, your bare feet warmed by the sun but no longer scorched. The wind that had been dry and restless hours earlier now stirred with more gentleness, as though even the air had grown tired from holding the heat. You didn't go straight to the next task. For a few minutes you allowed yourself the luxury of sitting on the low step beneath the fig tree that arched over the southeastern wall. Its leaves fluttered lightly above your head, casting dancing patches of shade that reminded you of the surface of a shallow pool. You leaned your head back against the sun-warmed stone and watched a bird hop between the tree's thin branches, pecking half-heartedly at an unripe fig, before fluttering off with a brief complaint. It was not often that you sat without motion during the day, and the stillness felt both foreign and welcome, like slipping into a forgotten rhythm. There were voices in the distance, muffled by the thick air and softened by the high stone walls. Somewhere a clay jar was being moved, its base scraping faintly as it slid across the floor. A group of younger servants passed nearby, their laughter low and fleeting, vanishing quickly as they disappeared around the corner. You didn't join them, not because you weren't welcome, but because some days solitude held more comfort than companionship. Especially on a day like this, when your body ached in familiar places and your mind had grown full from the unspoken weight of ritual and repetition. Your fingers idly traced the edge of your robe, smoothing a crease, tugging at a loose thread. You thought of the cloths you had just washed, now hanging in the sun somewhere behind you, their fibres releasing the last of the water they had carried from basin to basin. You wondered if, when dry, they would remember your hands. Perhaps not in any way that mattered to the world, but in the way that objects sometimes do, quietly absorbing the shape of those who hold them. As the shadows thickened and the air cooled slightly, a temple steward called softly from the upper corridor. The evening tasks would begin soon. The statue would be readied for its brief passage to the outer chamber to greet the setting sun, and the lesser attendants were needed to light the path and prepare the air with fresh incense. You stood stretching slowly, and made your way to the storeroom to gather what was needed. A tray of unlit oil lamps, a pouch of myrrh, resin, and the small brass censer carved with looping spirals that you always thought looked like waves curling in on themselves. You moved quietly down the hall, your arms full, your steps sure. The scent of the temple was changing again, shifting from the bright sharpness of midday offerings to the deeper, more solemn blend of woods and spice meant to accompany nightfall. As you passed beneath the high arch leading to the inner shrine, you paused to adjust the tray. A breeze came from somewhere above, rustling the hanging cloth near the doorframe, and with it came the scent of the myrrh already beginning to smoulder in the deeper chambers. It was a scent that always brought stillness with it, the kind that made even the smallest task feel like part of something immense and ancient. Inside the preparation room, you found the others already working. The statue had been unveiled, its linen wrappings set aside, and the figure now sat in solemn majesty at the centre of the room. It was not large, but the presence it carried filled the space in a way that made everyone speak in quieter voices, move with steadier hands. You placed the tray down beside the door and began arranging the lamps in a crescent on the floor, each one spaced evenly, their wicks trimmed and waiting. The girl beside you handed you the lighting taper, already burning softly, and you moved from lamp to lamp, touching flame to oil, bringing light into form one flicker at a time. When the last flame caught, you sat back on your heels and looked around. The glow was soft and steady, casting warm halos on the floor, the walls, and the polished features of the god's image. In that light, everything seemed suspended, outside time, outside noise, outside even thought. It was as if the temple itself had taken a breath and was holding it just for this moment, waiting for the sun to fall and the final words of the day to be spoken. And as you sat there, bathed in lamplight and silence, you felt again that quiet certainty that had grown within you over these many weeks, that your work, simple as it often seemed, mattered, that each cloth, each bowl, each step was part of something far larger than you, and yet entirely dependent on hands like yours. You bowed your head, not in exhaustion, but in reverence. The day was not over, but it was reaching its close, and you had been part of its every turning. The moment before the statue was lifted always held a silence unlike any other. It wasn't imposed or ordered. It simply arrived like a low tide, pulling back all movement and sound until only breath remained. You knelt quietly just outside the sanctum, watching through the carved doorway as the attendants moved into position. The priest stood closest to the figure, his arms raised slightly, the long folds of his linen robe brushing the floor. He did not speak yet. His eyes remained fixed on the statue's face as though waiting for some invisible nod, some silent acknowledgement that God was ready to move. The others held their corners of the wooden platform, fingers poised but still, every motion calibrated in advance, rehearsed in body memory. You knew your place in this ritual. You had no part in the lifting. That duty belonged to those further along in their service. But you had your own role. You carried the censer. The brass bowl was warm in your hands now, the coals inside glowing dimly beneath the powdered resin you had just scattered. The first wisps of smoke were already curling into the air, their scent thick and smooth, winding between the columns and drifting along the floor like a tide of dreams. You inhaled slowly, the fragrance threading its way into your chest and loosening the knots that had formed there throughout the day. When the priest gave the signal, the statue was raised with care, the wooden platform groaning slightly under the weight, though its carriers showed no strain. Their eyes stayed forward, their steps measured and slow. The image of the god, small but heavy with presence, seemed to glide rather than shift, and you followed behind, your footsteps matching the rhythm, your arms swinging the censer gently to release the incense into the path ahead. The others had already lit the lamps that marked the way. Their soft flames flickered as the evening wind moved through the open spaces of the temple, and the shadows they cast danced across the stone like ancient script being written and rewritten in firelight. You could feel the shift in the air as the group passed beneath the archway and into the open chamber where the sun's final light touched the floor. It was this moment the ritual had waited for, the brief alignment of God and sun, of fire and breath, of gold and silence. The statue was placed carefully in its holding space, facing west, its eyes directed toward the last edge of the horizon, just visible through the high window slit. No words were spoken. There was nothing to say. The light itself was the language, and its slow retreat across the polished floor was the message. You stood slightly behind the platform, the censer now resting at your feet, the smoke continuing its silent work. The heat of the coals reached your skin in soft waves, and for a moment you closed your eyes, letting yourself feel the fullness of the hour, not tiredness, That had passed into something gentler. This was the feeling of having arrived at the end of something real, something that could not be written down but only lived. Around you, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to pause. And then, as if released by some unseen hand, the light shifted again. The sun dipped further, and the beam that had held the statue's face in gold now slid downward, catching the edge of the platform before dissolving into shadow. The moment had passed, and the priest stepped forward once more. He made a small gesture, nothing elaborate, a simple touch to the base of the statue's stand. The signal was clear, the ritual was complete. The bearers stepped forward again, lifting the platform as steadily as before, and began the slow return to the sanctum. You followed, swinging the censer again, the scent deepening now as more resin burned away. It felt heavier somehow, as though the smoke itself was weighted with memory. When the statue was placed back in its chamber and rewrapped in its protective linens, you watched from the side as the priest whispered his final words. You could not hear them, but you had heard similar ones before, and you imagined their shape. Gratitude, protection, continuance. As the sanctum doors were pulled close behind him, you turned toward the basin nearby and washed your hands with the water left for ritual cleansing. The coolness was welcome, washing away not just the thin film of ash from the censer, but something more subtle, the trace of the hour's reverence, the echo of the sacred moment. You dried your hands on the cloth provided, folded it back into its niche, and stepped into the corridor where the light had faded fully now. The lamps still burned along the walls, their glow soft and golden, and the air smelled of night. Outside, the sky had turned to indigo. A single star blinked into view, followed by another, as though someone had begun sewing a new pattern onto the fabric of the world. You walked toward the servants' hall, your feet quieter now, your steps slow not from exhaustion but from fullness. You had carried the smoke, you had followed the light, you had stood in the narrow space between the sacred and the unseen, and in doing so you had become a part of it. The scent of barley bread was the first to greet you as you stepped into the servants' hall. It drifted low and warm through the open doorway, mingling with the faint traces of lamp oil and the earth's sweet smell of baked clay. You paused there a moment, letting the smell settle over you like a soft blanket, the kind that reminded your body that it had done enough for the day, that rest was not only allowed but necessary. The hall was already filling with quiet movement. Mats were being unrolled along the edges, bowls passed from hand to hand, the day's end unwinding itself not with fanfare, but with the steady rhythm of hunger, habit, and worn camaraderie. You took your place along the far wall, tucking your legs beneath you as another servant passed a tray of rough, flat loaves. You chose one with a corner missing, its edge slightly burnt, not because you minded, but because it reminded you of home. Your mother always gave the burnt ones to herself first, claiming the char was good for digestion. You smiled faintly as you tore the piece in half, the crust crackling between your fingers, and dipped it into the bowl of oil, crushed herbs that sat between you and the boy beside you. He was younger than you, new enough that he still looked surprised each time someone remembered his name, but his hands moved with the practiced ease of someone learning fast. Theo. Hall was never loud, but it hummed with soft voices, the occasional laugh, the scrape of pottery, the sigh of a long day loosening from the spine. Someone plucked a single-stringed lyre near the corner, not playing a song exactly, just coaxing sound from it like testing the memory of a forgotten tune. You let your gaze drift across the room, watching the way the light from the hanging lamps caught in the shallow bowls, casting dancing reflections on the floor. Everything seemed slower now, each motion drawn out by weariness but softened by comfort. The urgency of the day had faded. What remained was the closeness that comes when people share the same tiredness, the same tasks, the same bread. As you ate, your mind drifted. Not far, just back along the path of the day, replaying moments like beads sliding through your fingers. The sweep of the broom along the walkway, the quiet weight of the linen bundles, the way the sunlight had caught the statue's face just before it faded. Each moment felt clearer now. Not in a sharp way, but like ripples settling into still water. You realised you hadn't spoken more than a few words since midday. It hadn't felt lonely, but now, surrounded by quiet voices and full bellies, the silence seemed to deepen inside you. Not empty, but full in its own way. The boy beside you nudged the oil bowl closer without looking up, a small gesture that said more than any sentence. You dipped the last of your bread and chewed slowly, the herbs sharp on your tongue, the oil smooth and grounding. Someone passed a cup of diluted beer, and you took it gratefully, the liquid cool against the inside of your mouth. It wasn't meant to refresh exactly, more to settle, to fill in the spaces left hollow by the heat and the long hours. You drank slowly, savouring the faint bitterness, the trace of fermentation that spoke of grain and time. After the meal, the mats were folded again, bowls stacked near the washing basin, and the hall grew even quieter. Some began to drift toward the sleeping quarters. Others lingered, rubbing their feet, whispering stories in the hush of firelight. You stayed where you were, not yet ready to stand. The floor beneath you was warm, the air still rich with the mingled breath of those who had eaten, and outside the night was deepening. You could see the stars clearly now through the open shutter. They blinked slowly, patiently, scattered across the sky. Like beads, spilled from a careless hand. You thought of your family again. The way your brother used to toss pebbles at the ceiling beams when he couldn't sleep. The way your grandmother hummed old songs while shelling lentils. You hadn't seen them in what felt like seasons, and yet they arrived now in your thoughts with the same ease as breath. Perhaps that was the strange gift of service in the temple. It took you away from the world, but in doing so it brought parts of it back to you in sharper relief. You hadn't forgotten them, you'd simply carried them differently, folded into the corners of your silence. At last you rose and stepped toward the outer hall. You would sleep soon beneath the shared ceiling, on the straw-stuffed mat that had moulded itself to the shape of your spine. But for now, you walked through the courtyard once more, letting the night air cool your skin, letting the stars guide your steps. The stone beneath your feet still held the warmth of the day, but the breeze brushing past your arms whispered of rest. You paused near the basin to wash your hands once more, not for cleanliness, but for closure. And as the water ran over your fingers, disappearing into the shallow trough, you let the day go. Not with effort, just with the ease of someone who knows it will return again, with new tasks, new silence, and the same sacred breath of devotion. The sleeping quarters were not large, but they held a kind of comfort that only came after long hours of labour. You entered with slow steps, the scent of straw and worn linen surrounding you like the hush of evening tide lapping gently at a riverbank. The door stood slightly ajar, creaking faintly as the wind moved through, and within, the shadows had gathered in soft corners, cradled by the flickering lamplight that clung to the far wall. You recognised the figures already curled on their mats, their shapes familiar in the way night makes every body seem more honest, stripped of duty, free of posture. There was no hierarchy here, no task list, no ritual, just sleep waiting like an old friend. You made your way to your usual place near the wall, where the ceiling painting had begun to fade in patches but still showed the wings of the goddess Nut stretching overhead. She was painted in deep blue, her arms and legs arching over the sky, holding the stars against her skin. You had often stared at her before sleep, watching how the light from the lamps seemed to dance along her outline, as though she moved even in stillness. It comforted you in a way you couldn't quite explain, knowing that someone had once stood here and painted her with such care. Someone with a brush, some pigment, and time enough to dream a goddess into being. Your mat creaked slightly as you settled onto it, adjusting the thin blanket across your legs, folding one corner beneath your knee. The day's aches had begun to pool in your limbs now, not sharply, but like the slow heaviness of river silt settling after a flood. You let it come, breathing into it, knowing it meant the day had been fully lived. Around you the others whispered in tones too low to follow. Someone chuckled softly, a brief ripple of sound that faded almost as soon as it began. The boy who had sat beside you at supper was already asleep, his hand resting lightly across his stomach, his mouth slightly open in the way of someone who had surrendered fully to rest. You turned onto your side, facing the wall, your eyes brushing once more against the curve of Nut's painted fingers. These stars above her head were uneven, drawn in a line that wavered slightly, as if the painter's hand had trembled or the ladder beneath him had shifted. That imperfection made you love the image even more. It reminded you that sacred things were often made by tired hands, by ordinary people doing their best beneath tired skies. You smiled faintly at the thought, your fingers curling loosely against your cheek as the blanket warmed to your skin. Outside, the wind rustled through the reeds beyond the outer wall, its rhythm soft and scattered, like a lullaby forgotten halfway through. The night insects had begun their quiet singing, the occasional chirp rising above the hum of others, not in harmony, but not in discord either. Just as it always was, the temple wrapped itself in the music of its own living parts, each sound part of the breath that passed through these ancient walls long after voices fell silent. As your eyes began to close, thoughts slipped through your mind like leaves on water. You remembered the basin near the herb garden, the flicker of a beetle's shell in the dust, the weight of the censer in your hand as the god statue was carried toward the last light. These moments did not seem disconnected. They strung together now like a necklace, each bead pressed with meaning, with warmth, with effort. You did not need to recount them aloud. You felt them in your bones, in the stretch of your shoulders, in the worn soles of your feet. Sleep was coming gently, without need for chasing. You welcomed it like a familiar scent, like the touch of cool cloth against a fevered brow. The temple had quieted around you, its breath now slow and steady, and you knew that even in rest it remained alive. The gods might not speak in words, but they stirred in the silent hours, in the rustle of mats, in the rhythm of shared breath, in the dreams carried beneath the painted ceiling. Your last thought before surrendering to sleep was not of duty, or fear, or even memory. It was something simpler, a sense of being where you belonged, of having given what you could, carried what you must, and arrived at this stillness honestly. And then you slept, not as a servant nor a vessel, but simply as a soul wrapped in quiet. The night carried on without incident, cradling you in its cool arms, and somewhere between the hush of wind against the stone and the shifting sighs of sleeping bodies around you, a dream began to form. It was not like the ones that came in flashes or confusion. This one unfolded slowly, like the opening of a lotus blossom on still water. You found yourself standing on the banks of the Nile, though it looked different in the dream, wider, quieter. The water moved without sound, as if it respected the weight of your gaze. Moonlight brushed the surface in long silver streaks, and the stars above reflected in the river like scattered grains of barley cast across dark cloth. You felt neither hot nor cold, just present, as though the river had summoned you for some purpose you didn't yet understand. You looked down and saw your feet submerged up to the ankles in the shallows, the silt curling gently around your toes. Across the water stood a grove of palms, taller than any you remembered, their fronds shimmering faintly as if dusted with stars themselves. A boat was moored nearby, small and narrow, its frame delicate yet sure. You knew instinctively that you would not board it, not now, perhaps not for many seasons. But its presence comforted you, as though it waited only to carry you when your story within the temple had fully ripened. Behind you the land rose gently, dotted with familiar figures from your daily life. The woman who washed cloth by the garden, the boy who offered you the oil dish. Even the priest standing quietly with his eyes closed, hands resting on the staff that never left his side. They did not speak. None of them did. But their faces were soft, and they watched you not with judgment, but with a stillness that felt like understanding. You turned back to the river, and the moonlight deepened, turning the water to silvered ink. Somewhere far downstream, a heron lifted off the bank and flew low, its wings brushing the surface, drawing a line that faded almost as soon as it formed. And then, as dreams do, it all began to dissolve, the edges softening, the figures drifting away like mist at sunrise. You did not fight it. You let the water fade, the stars dim, the earth recede, until all that remained was the warmth of your breath and the stillness of morning just beginning to stir. You woke slowly, as if your body had only just remembered it belonged to the world of touch and weight and breath. The mat beneath you was cool in places where the blanket had slipped, and the faint scent of clay and reed lingered in the air. Somewhere close by, someone was stirring a small fire to warm the morning water, and the soft crackle of dried wood breaking into flame whispered of another day about to begin. You didn't open your eyes at first. You lay still, letting the quiet soak into you, letting the dream dissolve gently without trying to grasp it. There was a thin thread of memory, a boat, a moon, the river's hush. But it floated just out of reach now, and you let it drift, trusting that whatever it meant had already folded itself into your bones. When you finally sat up, the hall was awash in soft gold. The light came low through the open doorway, filtered through the gauze of morning dust and smoke. Most of the others were still curled beneath their blankets, their breathing deep and even. A few had risen, moving slowly through the room with the silence of those who had done so many mornings like this they no longer needed to think. You stretched carefully, feeling the stiffness pull through your back and shoulders, and then stood, wrapping your linen over your shoulder with practiced hands. You didn't need a call or a bell to know the rhythm. Your body already knew. It, marked by the cycles of water and fire, of cleaning and carrying, of smoke rising and silence settling. Outside, the air was crisp in a way that only lasted for a short time before the sun climbed high and pressed its weight down onto the stones. You crossed the courtyard, barefoot, feeling the texture of sand between your toes and the faint moisture of dew that clung to the edge of the shadows. You dipped your hands into the water basin near the herb wall and let it run cool across your skin. A few green shoots had pushed their way up through the cracks in the stone nearby, small and defiant, as if to remind the temple that even in its stillness, the earth was always growing. The broom was back in your hands before the sun had lifted fully over the eastern wall. It was a different kind of morning today. The breeze held a softness that had been missing in recent days, and the sky bore that pale shade of blue that made the edges of the clouds glow like beaten copper. You moved slowly along the edge of the outer walkway, brushing away the thin scatter of sand that had gathered in soft curls overnight. Each stroke of the broom felt like a continuation of the dream you'd left behind, a rhythm begun in sleep and carried now into waking life. The dust lifted lightly and then settled again, as if reluctant to leave the stone it had rested on. As you worked, your mind stayed quiet. It didn't rush ahead to the tasks waiting in the storeroom, or the trays that would need washing before the midday rites. It simply stayed here with your hands and the stone, with the quiet song of morning unfolding in small sounds around you. A door creaked open in the distance, and the low thud of a jar being set down echoed briefly before being swallowed by silence again. Somewhere above, pigeons clattered their wings against the high beams, shaking loose a single feather that floated lazily downward until it landed near your feet. You swept around it carefully, as if not to disturb its landing place. The sun climbed a little higher, and with it came the familiar warmth beginning to press against your back. But it was gentle still, the kind of heat that reminded you the day was new, not yet stern. You straightened your back and leaned against the nearest column for a breath, letting your eyes trace the carvings there, the looping spirals and the line of hieroglyphs you had long ago stopped trying to understand but still respected. They seemed to tell a story of balance, of offerings made and accepted, of cycles honoured and renewed. And in a quiet way, you felt part of that story now, Not carved in stone, but lived in moments. In the hush of a sunrise, in the sweep of a broom, in the stillness you carried forward into whatever came next. Later that morning, the brazier was lit in the centre of the courtyard, its coals carefully coaxed into flame with dried husks and shavings of cedar bark. You had helped prepare it earlier, gathering the shavings from the storeroom where the wood was kept wrapped in linen to preserve its fragrance. The fire caught slowly, its first breath weak and thin, but as more resin was added, it came alive, curling upward in slow waves that shimmered against the warming air. You stood just beside the stone ring, not close enough to burn, but near enough to feel the brush of heat on your arms as you passed the sacred herbs from one bowl into the flame. The scent rose rich and full, earthy with a sharp sweetness, and the smoke moved across the courtyard like a veil, softening every edge it touched. Around you, the temple stirred with its usual rhythm. Footsteps passed in measured cadence along the walkways, hands folded offerings into small clay dishes, and the priest's voice drifted now and then from behind the high doors of the sanctum, speaking not to the servants, but to the divine. You didn't need to understand the words. Their weight hung in the air all the same. As the smoke deepened and the shadows retreated toward the western wall, you remained still for a moment, holding the bowl now empty, watching the way the scent worked its way into every corner. It didn't need to be seen to be believed. It simply was, like the warmth of the stone beneath your feet, like the breath that left your chest in a slow, even stream, like the quiet knowing that this was where you were meant to be, even if no one ever spoke your name aloud. The basin near the herb garden was already half filled by the time you arrived with the cloths, their fibres still damp from the earlier rites. You knelt beside it, your knees pressing into the smoothness of the worn floor, and dipped your hands into the cool surface. The water wrapped around your fingers like a sigh, carrying with it the traces of lavender and crushed mint that had been stirred into it that morning. You let your palms rest there for a moment, feeling the weight of the day's work beginning to loosen its grip, your body remembering the shape of stillness even as your hands prepared to move again. The cloths were heavy now, soaked not just in water but in the memory of smoke and skin and sacred touch. You lifted the first one slowly, spreading it across your lap, and began to press the water from it with careful movements, working along its length like a weaver moving thread by thread. Birdsong drifted down from the high wall, light and uncertain, and somewhere nearby a bee moved lazily through the air, its wings catching the sun in brief flashes. The breeze that passed through carried the faintest edge of sweetness from the fig trees beyond the courtyard, and for a moment everything felt suspended in a softness too gentle to name. You kept working, the cloths piling beside you, your fingers pruning at the edges, and yet you welcomed the ache. It was familiar now, honest in its own way, and as you leaned forward to rinse the last length of linen, watching the ripples dance outward across the basin's surface, you felt that quiet return again, the one that needed no words, only water, only cloth, only breath. When the last cloth was rinsed and laid across the drying stones near the wall, you lingered beside the herb garden, letting your fingers trail through the green. The leaves of the basil were warm to the touch, their scent rising eagerly the moment you brushed against them, and the marjoram reached outward with soft, curling stems that tangled slightly between your fingers. This corner of the temple always felt like it belonged to another world, quieter and older somehow, as if it remembered the years before your hands had ever worked here. Bees moved deliberately between the flowering stalks, and their humming filled the space with a rhythm steadier than breath. You crouched and pinched a sprig of thyme, rubbing it lightly between your fingers, breathing in the sharp, grounding aroma before setting it gently back into the soil. There was something deeply alive in these small moments, when no one was watching and nothing was expected. You pressed your palm flat to the earth near the edge of the garden bed, and let the heat sink into your skin. Somewhere in that warmth was every morning you had risen before light, every bowl you had carried, every whisper of ash and flame that had passed over your hands. And yet here, with dirt beneath your nails and the breeze brushing the back of your neck, you felt no burden in any of it, only presence, only the knowledge that this too was part of the temple's breath. A fig dropped from a high branch and landed with a soft thud nearby. You picked it up without thought, its skin slightly split, the flesh inside bright and sweet-smelling. You did not eat it. Instead, you placed it gently at the base of the nearest tree, a small offering to the quiet that had kept you company all this time. By late afternoon, the sun filtered through the high stone lattice above the corridor, casting thin lines of gold across the walkway. You traced one with your foot as you passed, following it like a thread back toward the storeroom. The air had thickened with heat, yet the stone underfoot still held a faint coolness if you stayed within the shaded path. You carried a jar now, half filled with scented oil, careful not to spill as it swayed slightly against your side. The oil had been mixed earlier with crushed rose petals and a trace of cinnamon bark, and its fragrance clung softly to your skin. As you walked, you felt the way time moved here, not as a river rushing forward, but as a slow turning of the same circle, again and again. Every task had been done before, would be done again. Yet none of them felt hollow. Each had its weight, each had its silence. When you set the jar down beside the others, aligning it just so, you paused. The sunlight touched your wrist, warm and steady, and in that moment it felt like the whole day paused with you. Not finished, just held. Quietly between breath and shadow, the priest passed you in the Bumblebee corridor without speaking, but his eyes paused on yours long enough to acknowledge the work you had done. Not praise, not command, just that lingering glance that said he had seen the jar in its place, the cloths folded, the brazier cleaned. It was enough. You bowed your head slightly, not out of duty, but from the quiet habit of respect that had grown inside you like the herbs in the garden. As he moved on, the trailing edge of his robe stirred the dust, and for a heartbeat, the air behind him shimmered with incense and purpose. You watched until his figure disappeared around the corner, then turned back to your own path. The temple had begun to lean into its final hours of light. Shadows lengthened along the walkways, and the coolness had started to creep back into the stones beneath your feet. Somewhere a door creaked open and closed again, the sound small but final, like the punctuation at the end of a sentence. You felt no hurry, only the steady rhythm that continued to hum in your chest. It was the same rhythm that guided your hands, your feet, your silence, the same rhythm that would carry you into the evening. As twilight deepened, you moved slowly through the quiet temple halls, collecting the last scattered bowls and lamps from their corners. The oil in them had burned low, leaving soft rings of soot that you wiped gently with a damp cloth. Each movement felt like closing a page in a long, slow book, the kind whose story was not found in words but in scent and weight and silence. The light outside had faded into a soft grey, and above the outer courtyard, the first star had begun to blink through the thickening dusk. You didn't stop to look for long. You'd come to know the sky not as something distant, but as something you moved beneath each day, its changes familiar as breath. The final bowl was tucked into its place, and the last cloth folded with care. No voice called your name, no hand touched your shoulder. But still, a sense of completion settled over you like a soft wrap. You paused in the doorway of the sleeping chamber, listening to the breath of others already resting, and you let out a slow breath of your own. It had been a full day, like many before it, yet somehow it had still felt like its own kind of story. Night had fully settled by the time you lay back on your mat, arms folded beneath your head, eyes open to the faint outline of the ceiling above. The painted sky of the goddess Nut had darkened with the fall of real night, her stars nearly invisible now, except where the moonlight slipped through the cracks in the shutters. You did not try to sleep at once. Instead, you simply lay there, listening to the hush of others breathing around you, the rustle of fabric, the softest creak of reed mats shifting under the slow weight of rest. There was no more to do, no more to carry. The temple, for now, was still. Your thoughts did not reach forward. They stayed here, folded into the quiet like a hand into soft earth. You thought of the smoke that curled from your censer, the warm basin water, the press of your fingers into linen, the hush of the wind in the garden. You had come to know these things not as tasks, but as companions. Each day had passed through your hands like river water, leaving traces that would never fully rinse away, not in a lifetime. And as your eyes finally drifted closed, you smiled quietly. You were part of the temple now, not carved, not named, but felt and kept, always.